sure I'm visible here. So welcome everyone to this launch and discussion of States of Liberation. I'm going to chat with the authors, Samuel Huneke and Lisa Duggan. My name is Greg Newton. I'm the co-founder with my partner, Donnie Duggan, of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, which is the space you now find yourself in. And we say that the Bureau is a government agency for a government that does not yet exist. And the primary service we provide is holding this space for queer books and queer culture of all kinds. So we are indeed an independent bookstore, and we also do exhibitions. Right now we have Frank Mulaney's Wallpaper Saints up on the walls, and we do tons of events like this. Most of them are in person again, thankfully, and we hope that trend continues. If you're interested, you can sign up for our email list at the register, and you'll get an email every other Monday about our upcoming events. And we've got a lot going on between now and the end of Pride Month. And then in July, we shall rest. So I'm going to introduce our two panelists, and then we're going to jump right in. So Samuel Huneke is assistant professor of history at George Mason University. His research focuses on the social and political history of 20th century Germany. His first book, States of Liberation, Gay Men Between Dictatorship and Democracy in Cold War Germany, examines gay persecution and liberation in Germany during the Cold War. He has written widely on the history of sexuality in modern Germany, publishing in scholarly journals including Central European History, New German Critique, and Journal of Contemporary History. He also writes regularly for the public venues, including Boston Review, The Point, and Los Angeles Review of Books. Lisa Duggan is a journalist, activist, and professor of social and cultural analysis at New York University. She is author of Sapphic Slashers, Sex, Sensationalism, and American Modernity, Twilight of Equality, Neoliberalism, Cultural Politics, and the Attack on Democracy, and Mean Girl, Ayn Rand, and Neoliberal Greed. So please give them a warm welcome, and let's jump right in.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that warm introduction, and I'm glad that you're all here. So I just was going to briefly introduce the book and then read a short excerpt from it, and I think we're going to have a conversation about it. Mm-hmm. So States of Liberation, it is a history of homosexuality, of both persecution and liberation in East and West Germany from the end of World War II up through the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then an epilogue that sort of takes us into the present, and that's what I'll be reading from. So again, it looks at both West Germany, which was a capitalist democracy founded by the three Western powers at the end of World War II, as well as East Germany, which was a communist dictatorship set up by the Soviet Union. One of the sort of questions I had for the book as I was starting it, or as I was setting out on this research, was how it is that a country goes from the Nazi dictatorship, which existed from 1933 to 1945 and was one of the most sort of brutally homophobic countries in modern history, how a country goes from that moment to only a few decades later, Germany today in the early 21st century, which is widely lauded as being one of the most sort of queer-friendly countries in the world. And so to answer that question, I went to various archives, I spoke to people who lived through this period, and it sort of led me to the very strange conclusion or finding that East Germany, which again was a communist dictatorship, in a lot of ways was actually much more progressive than West Germany when it came to queer issues. So both in terms of the persecution that gay men in particular faced, homosexuality was criminalized to a greater degree in West Germany. Around 50,000 gay men were convicted under paragraph 175, which criminalized male homosexuality in West Germany. East Germany, it was a far lower number. Similarly, gay liberation movements in certain ways had a great deal more success in East Germany in pushing their claims and their policies than in West Germany. So with that in mind, I'm going to read a short excerpt from the book, and then we'll get talking. Yeah. In 1994, 7 months before new federal elections, the government repealed paragraph 175, bringing to pass a core demand of West Germany's gay movement. For all its historical significance, though, the Bundestag, or West German parliament, approved the bill in more of a whimper than a bang. In an early debate, one Christian Democratic representative complained that the fact that, quote, we still have paragraph 175 is used by some homosexual groups to spread the notion that homosexual acts are still punished. He apparently favored repeal to deprive gay groups of what he considered to be no more than a propaganda device. On March 10th, 1994, paragraph 175 finally passed out of existence, extinguishing what one parliamentarian called, quote, the most famous statute of all. Its ultimate repeal, which arose from the need to reconcile East Germany's progressive criminal code with West Germany's regressive one, is one of the most concrete examples of East German gay liberation's afterlife. These developments suggest that there is merit in former Prime Minister Lothar de Maizier's striking contention that, quote, on the question of homosexuals, East Germany was substantially more open than West Germany. I think that this somewhat greater tolerance has since migrated into the West. 4 years later, on September 27, 1998, federal elections swept the Social Democrats back into power for the first time since 1982. With support from the new East German states, it won its highest proportion of votes vis-a-vis the Christian Democratic Union in post-war history and entered into coalition with the Green Party. The following year, Lieutenant Winfried Stecher, whom superiors describe as a, quote, super soldier, was discovered to be gay. Stecher's commanders subsequently demoted him to a desk job under army guidelines that allowed gay men as general infantry, but not as officers. Stecher sued the defense ministry, and his case went to the Federal Constitutional Court. Before the judges could rule on the merits, though, Social Democratic Defense Minister Rudolf Scharping decided to withdraw the discriminatory rules and allow Stecher to return to his old position. These changes indicate that reform brought not revolution, but rather the opportunity for new reform. Events of the last 3 decades imply, moreover, that such reform is unstable and moves in a jagged fashion. Lesbians and gay men continued to be victims of violence, while legal advances often materialize slowly. Germany's path has not allowed it to break free of history's moorings and chart a revolutionary new sexual ethic. Rather, its history bequeathed it a kind of steady evolution in the recognition of homosexual citizenship. In fact, when one pauses to consider it, gay liberation is rarely a story of revolution. Much oftener, it is one of slow change over time that, as queer scholars increasingly recognize, typically bring and train a host of new worries and repressions. One might even ask if revolution is ever an appropriate term to describe changes in sexual laws, policing, and morality. On closer inspection, the progress of Germany's gay liberations thus reveals a deeply uneven process. The symbols we take as evidence of liberation, thundering nightclubs and rainbow-festooned streets, often dissemble, telling a different story than that of science or of the law. Examining social, medical, cultural, political, and legal evidence offers at least 5 different stories of gay liberation, some moving faster than others, some steadily, some haphazardly, all unexpectedly. East German gay men and lesbians undeniably enjoyed greater legal protections than did their counterparts in West Germany, who in turn enjoyed a richer commercial subculture of bars, saunas, magazines, museums, and clubs. And then I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. This confused amalgamation of progress and regress should not surprise. Just as a comparison of animus in each Germany reveals there to be no one such thing as homophobia, so too the history of liberation efforts in post-war Germany is a story of strange bedfellows, of the uneven and unexpected advance of gay priorities. Gay life and politics in modern Germany are nothing more or less than the result of the contingent paths that they took over the last 7 decades. It is not, though, all bad, not by any stretch of the imagination. Gay and lesbian citizens mobilized in extraordinary ways in Cold War Germany. They forced the hand of one of the era's most infamously inflexible dictatorships. They brought politicians in the West German democracy to heel in a remarkably public way in the late 1970s. More than anything, they survived the legacy of a murderous fascist regime to carve out a place of acceptance and celebration for themselves in the heart of Europe. And if you wander over to the beautiful East Berlin neighborhood of Prenzlauer Berg some afternoon, you will find, standing on a leafy street corner, a cafe, tended by queer people young and old, offering everything from trans evenings and lesbian hangouts to soccer viewing parties and roundtables with elderly LGBT people. It's the Sunday Club, the same organization that East German activists founded in 1983, and a happy reminder of the impermanent permanence of the past.
Thank you. This book is full of so much. There's so much going on in this book. So I have a method to my madness here. And that is, I want to go through the two, what I see as the two major arguments that you're making. And first I'll tell you and give you a chance to just elaborate on it. And then I have some critical questions about it for both your two major arguments. And then you're making two, I think, really crucial interventions on the level of concepts and definition. I'm going to ask you about those two.
Okay, great.
So this is how we're going. This is how we're playing this game. Okay, so one of your primary interventions is to intervene in the Cold War assumption, several Cold War assumptions, but one central one, that liberal democracy, on the one hand, is where we have dynamic and flexible progress. And on the other hand, dictatorship, communist dictatorship, is the site of stasis and reaction and constraint. And you are, this is an assumption that most English speaking and global North people would just assume, and you are trying to intervene in that. And that's one of the major things you're doing with this book, based on research, incredible research in East Germany, especially.
Yeah.
So just tell us more about what that intervention is.
Right, exactly. So you've hit the nail on the head. So I think a lot of us have this sort of assumption from the Cold War that we have this sort of myth or this idea of the good West and the evil East, right? And as you said, it's very much a notion that in the West, progress and change is possible, and in sort of Eastern dictatorships, change is not possible, and that it's only possible with a sort of imposition of liberal capitalist democracy. And I think, that's very much the assumption that I came in with when I started this research. And so I was very much expecting to find that East Germany, as an inflexible communist dictatorship, was not a friendly place for queer people, and that West Germany, in fact, was. What I ultimately found, though, was a much more complicated picture, and that's sort of what I try to tell here. And so on the question of persecution, as I mentioned, when we look at the 1950s and 1960s, you have an incredible wave of persecution against gay men in West Germany, over 50,000 convictions in the space of 20 years. And in East Germany, it's a much lower number. And this, as I sort of make the case for, has to do with the enduring fears and sort of ideologies from Nazism in West Germany. That West Germany was never fully denazified. You have both a lingering of Nazi rhetoric as well as Nazi personnel. A lot of the judges and prosecutors in West Germany are holdovers from the Nazi period, whereas in East Germany, you have a much more thoroughgoing denazification. And so that, in the 50s and 60s, is really why you have this sort of surprising lenience towards gay men in the communist East. The even more surprising thing, I think, is that in the 70s and 80s, you have gay liberation movements that get started in both countries. And they get started in the West first, which is what you would expect, right? I mean, this is, in the early 70s, you have these action groups that spring up all around West Germany and Berlin, sort of major university towns and metropolises. And they take to the streets, they make these public demands for recognition, and they have some major successes and also some major setbacks. In East Germany, you have activists that are inspired in large part by these Western activists, and they start organizing in the 70s. And they do so knowing full well that they live in this dictatorship, that there's a secret police force, the Stasi, that will be very hostile to them. And so they're very savvy about trying to couch their demands in the rhetoric of socialism. And it's sort of a halting process. There's setbacks, but in the 80s, in the early 80s, these activists start organizing under the umbrella of the Protestant Church, which was sort of the only nominally independent organization in East Germany. And that already is quite shocking, right? You think of sexuality or homosexuality in particular as being hostile to religion, and vice versa, that religion is hostile to homosexuality. So they start organizing and they start spreading around the country. These groups sort of proliferate, and the Stasi really freaks out about this. decides it needs a new strategy and decides that that strategy will be to actually give in to their policy demands, thinking that, well, if we pass all these pro-gay policies, these groups won't have any reason to exist any longer. And so between 1985 and 1989, there's just an incredible deluge of these pro-gay policies, right? You have gay men allowed to serve in the military. The age of consent is equalized much earlier than most other Western and Eastern countries. You have marital and sexual health counseling centers that are opened up to queer clients. The government starts to commission movies and books on queer issues. So it's a quite remarkable moment of opening up. And what I argue is that it shows that, in fact, change is possible in authoritarian settings. And the goal of that is not to say that authoritarianism is somehow good. It's not to sort of apologize for East Germany, but rather to say that the comparison to a place like East Germany should never serve to sort of, make the West look better by comparison, which I think is oftentimes the function of that comparison.
That's great. So the question I have to kind of probe into that a little bit is, the reason when I first became a fan of Sam's work, it was a review of this book about Foucault, The Last Man Takes LSD. What's the
it was The Last Man Takes LSD.
This is, and I really hate that book. And when I read Sam's review of it, it was like Sam did such a good job of analyzing, judiciously, fairly. So I know from the book is it's a left-wing attack on Foucault, right? So I'm have a much more positive relationship with the Foucauldian legacy. But anyway, so I know from reading that review that you're very well versed in the debates and discussions about neoliberal capitalism and its effect on. So the thing I wanted to ask you then is the other piece of the Cold War narrative, other than the one we just went through, is that it really collapses state forms and economic forms, so that you see capitalism and democracy are collapsed as if they were the same thing, and socialism and authoritarianism, dictatorship are collapsed as though they were the same thing. So then the comparison is between, liberal democracy and authoritarianism, and then the things that are deduced from that are seen to also be true of capitalism and socialism, right? So I think you do some of that collapsing and when you set up that. So I wanted to ask you some questions specifically about the economic underpinnings, rather than, so you focus very much on the state, and what the junking of the state. And to just give you a framework to, I'm sure you probably know this book, but there's this book by Kristen Gotzi. It's called
Why
Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism. Right? Great title. But the book is substantially focuses on East Germany.
Yeah.
Right. So, but she's focusing on the economics. She's saying, all the surveys, we compare West Germany, East Germany, women were much more satisfied with their sex lives. They were much more, all good stuff in East Germany. Again, another surprise, right? And she's saying, well, but the reasons for that are economic, right? It's because women are not materially dependent on men in East Germany, so they can choose whether they, marry or don't marry or do what. They have childcare, they're supported childcare, their lives are less stressful, there's less precarity. So because of the material, economic, and she's kind of leaving the state form aside and talking about the economy. She's saying that's how we can think about, sex being better for women in East Germany and West Germany. Your book is about men for very good reasons. It's almost impossible to write about both gay men and lesbians. It's completely different planets in this time period. But I was wondering about the economic underpinnings of what you're talking about.
That's a great question. I think, the sort of easy answer is that I, sort of went into the archives and the sort of biggest trove of files I found were these Stasi files, right?
Yeah.
And so that sort of really drove the story I was going to tell. Yeah. But I think as I was writing the book, I did increasingly come back to economics. And I agree. I think I do sometimes collapse the two.
Well, it's the other part of it, completely assumed, in the global north, that collapse is absolutely almost universal.
Right.
So taking them apart is like, I spend my whole teaching life taking them apart. and saying,
Yeah, no.
no, capitalism and democracy are not the same thing. In fact, capitalism is oligarchic. But anyway,
Right. As we are discovering, in fact.
but you know, so it's there. It's a, and it would be in the archives. It would be in the
Oh,
sources. You know, but
Exactly. And so I think, you know, part of this, well, my mind's going in too many different directions. I think when it comes to East Germany, again, I'm mostly focused on men, as you point out. And I think in this case, the economics are sort of manifest them in themselves insofar as most of these activists, or many of these activists, are, you know, more or less believers in the socialist project, right? In fact,
of
that's
course they have to say they are.
but I actually think most of them truly were, to a certain extent. I mean, many of them were actually party members, which, you know, wasn't everyone. It was, and you know, on one hand, they had benefited, right? They were oftentimes people who either they or their parents had come from working class backgrounds and actually really benefited from the social mobility that East Germany afforded them, right?
Yeah.
It was, they might have been the first people in their families to go to a university because, right? And so,
Yeah.
so there was a certain loyalty to the socialist state because of that. That I don't think was just sort of savviness or just sort of writing what they thought those in power wanted to hear. And I think that it resonates with Godzi's argument, right? Because it's about how material benefits for women, in her case, you know, create these circumstances for, you know, happiness to thrive. And so I think to
Well, I know we underplaying the authoritarian.
right, exactly,
Right?
exactly,
Yeah, right.
exactly. And so I think in this case, though, you know, and I guess part of what I was trying to do was decouple the notion that gay liberation is intrinsically, you know, having gay magazines or gay clubs, right? I think that's something that, again, we intuitively think of as, oh, you're liberating, it's consumerism, right? And so what I was trying to do in making this comparison was showing how the different economic forms offer different types of liberation, both the different state forms and the different economic forms. And so in East Germany, it isn't a commercial form of liberation. You don't have a ton of, you know, gay magazines and gay publications. You do have some that the government, you know, commissions. And you do have these sort of, you know, this world of house parties that evolves, but it's much more both reliant on the state on one hand, but also much more private. It's something that people are creating in these networks together. Whereas in West Germany, you do have this sort of consumer capitalist type of liberation that evolves. And for some, right, exactly. For some, for those who can make it to places like West Berlin, again, predominantly for gay men, for those with money, usually university students who, you know, in Germany, it's a much smaller percentage of the population that goes to university. And so I think one thing that made the comparison with US critiques of neoliberalism and sort of the intersection of queerness and neoliberalism, not a quite one-to-one comparison, is that in West Germany, you do have neoliberalism, but it's of a very different flavor, right? You have you have ordo liberalism, right? Starting in the 50s, you have this sort of, you know, the quote unquote social market. And that never really goes away. Even when Helmut Kohl, this, you know, conservative, comes into power as chancellor in the 1980s, he never enacts the kind of sweeping reforms that people like Reagan or Thatcher do. And so you still have this notion of a market economy that is, but it still has a social responsibility to both rein in the market and to provide for people. So
State capitalism.
right, no, that's exactly what it is. And so anyway, that's
Yeah. So so I was just curious because I think it doesn't conflict with your story. I think it sort of would supplement your story.
I agree.
So the other big argument that you're making, which you've referred to now, and also when you were reading from the epilogue, is you're saying that the idea that progressive state policy and law reform go along with the expansion of subcultures, that our assumption that they go together. Right. When you get one, you get the other. You get state policy, law reform, and a progressive direction at the same time that you get an expanded subculture, and you are saying that doesn't hold.
Right, or it doesn't necessarily.
Yeah. So Just,
Yeah, no, so exactly, I mean,
Yeah.
and this is sort of where this comparison comes about. And I think the first place I find it is in East Germany in the 50s and 60s. And as I've sort of alluded to, in that period, you have this lesser criminalization. And you know, in a lot of ways, it's a return to the status quo in the 1920s when you have this sort of, it's the famous Weimar era, you know, sort of roaring 20s. It's this incredibly, again, for certain people in sort of privileged, largely privileged people in metropolises, this sort of very queer time. And what's sort of striking is that you have a reversion to this legally, but not culturally, right? You don't have a return of this sort of subculture. You don't all of a sudden have all these, you know, queer dance halls opening up again. You don't have all these publications that start publishing. I think the reason for that is quite clear, right? That this is, especially in the 50s, a very authoritarian state form that is really not interested in allowing those sorts of expressions of individuality and so on. So that was the first place where I noted this sort of disconnect, that essentially you have a much more liberal legal regime than you do in West Germany, but you don't have a substantially more sort of liberal or open society. Then I think that difference becomes really stark in the 70s and 80s, where these gay liberation efforts take two really strikingly different trajectories. In East Germany, as I've talked about, you have incredible success at promulgating pro-gay and lesbian policies at a national level, but you don't have this flourishing commercial subculture. Again, as we've talked about, this isn't a capitalist society. Conversely, in West Germany, because you do have consumer capitalism, after homosexuality is largely decriminalized, magazines and bars and clubs and saunas can sort of spring forth and flourish and find a consumer base. But conversely, these movements have very little success at pushing their policy at the national level. And so what I really found was that our assumption that these two things, legal reform and a flourishing subculture, we assume that they're together. And at least in the case of East and West Germany, we can see quite clearly that they don't.
Yeah. You know, the way to get a really sort of a bigger comparative grid would be, you already have broadened the comparative grid so much for thinking about this by just writing about East and West Germany, would be though to have, like, you know, the capitalist authoritarianism like Putin's Russia, right? And have democratic socialism like they're trying to build in Chile, right? And to have all four of those, then you wouldn't be in such danger of seeing the, you know, capitalism, democracy, socialism, authoritarianism as kind of collapsing in these two. But the other thing I wanted to ask you about this incredibly important distinction you were making between law reform and the expansion of subcultures was, I also wanted to ask you, you know, I mean, there's this new work that's come out in the past 5 or so years about the way that actual legal equality can be part and parcel of a repressive imperial colonial regime. So like the work on pinkwashing, right? Or the work on that actually says progressive law reform and equality in some places can be used as in a way to pinkwash a state that is oppressing and mistreating poor people. There are actually a lot written in the US about that. So Chanda Reddy's book, Freedom with Violence, which is about how you get, at the same time that you get gay rights, you're getting the Elimination of Voting Rights Act and the rounding up of the rights. And like the gay equality is like an apple, right? And it doesn't apply to all. It only applies to the sort of homo-nationalist, you know, constituency. So that's another way in which that's like the law reform thing. So I wonder in relation to Germany, whether you have any thoughts about that.
Yes, I mean, so so sorry, processing all of that. There's a lot. So I mean, I obviously, I find the idea of pinkwashing incredibly compelling, obviously, right? I mean, this notion that essentially, as you're saying, the promulgation of gay rights can go hand in hand with more sort of repressive state forms, and especially when it comes to other minority groups, which oftentimes overlap with queer populations. And so certainly in Germany, I think there's been a great deal of pinkwashing insofar as it has allowed certain groups to use being at least ostensibly pro-gay as cover for xenophobia, and in particular Islamophobia, which is of course quite common.
It's a huge cover for Islam.
Yes,
Right.
it is. And, you know, I mean, we saw even Trump do this, right, in the 2016 campaign. He was the actual sort of pro-gay candidate because he wanted to
That's pretty
stop.
funny. Yeah.
Right? I mean, it is.
Yeah.
And so in Germany, you certainly have that, I think, especially after the fall of the wall. I think there's certainly an element of the SED, the Socialist Unity Party, trying to use their sort of support for gay rights as maybe a cover for their authoritarian practices in a way. I mean, I found some of these campaign posters from the 1990 election, which is the only free and fair election in East Germany. The successor party of the SED is sort of seems to be using its support for gay rights as a way to sort of recast itself as a sort of social democratic party. I think, you know, again, I don't think you see that as much in West Germany until after unification, because the state hasn't embraced gay rights, it hasn't embraced these things, and so it's not sort of available as an alibi in that way. I will say, again, I think that this notion of pinkwashing and the way that the West in the last 20 or 30 years has adopted gay rights in a certain type and flavor
And
of
only
gay
in
rights.
certain contexts.
And
I
only in
won't
certain-
say, we have equality for women and people.
Right,
They
exactly.
are barbaric.
And I think it's essentially the same narrative as that Cold War stereotype that we started out with, right? It's essentially creating a division between, you know, we are good and they are evil, and now acceptance of queer people, or, you know,
Comes
certain,
out of the good.
it becomes right. And you know, you can see this in Obama's second inaugural address, where he sort of mentioned Stonewall as part of this arc of American liberalism. And so I think there's a fundamental similarity there between pinkwashing and these Cold War narratives.
That's really true. So I'm going to ask you two more much shorter questions about your definitions, and then we'll give a chance if people want to ask you questions. So there are two concepts that I think you did a lot of really important work on. And one of them is you have used the term anti-gay animus instead of homophobia.
Yes.
So, say something about that.
So this was something that sort of evolved again over the course of writing this book, that I started out using the word homophobia, and you know, we all know homophobia was invented in the sort of late 20th century, and it increasingly struck me that this was not, it was too broad of a category for what I was trying to get at. What I was trying to get at was specifically, why was it that these two German states criminalized homosexuality in different ways, that they, you know, that queer people, and specifically gay men, endured stigma, but in different ways with different language. And it seemed to be, to me, that this animus, as I call it, was serving different purposes in these two different states. That if we just thought of it as homophobia, it becomes this sort of static, ahistorical thing that has existed for all time, and that we can equally talk about the execution of sodomites in the medieval era as homophobia, as well as, you know, East Germany's sort of anti-gay propaganda. And it seemed to me that you actually can't do that. And so, because homophobia is so embedded in how we think and talk about this, I wanted to find other concepts and other words to describe this animus. I also talk about prejudice sometimes, taboo, so on. And so
Well, animus, I think, is really particularly good because it's not necessarily psychological.
Right.
Whereas phobia,
It's
and
fear.
even prejudice, it's like it's individualized and psychologized, whereas animus is a social, can be, it can be individualized, but it's a social, political. And you have a really great breaking down of all the sources of anti-gay animus, right? The gay conspiracy stuff, which is wild. And the gay spies, there's a whole chapter on gay spies, actual gay spies, as well as imagined gay spies. It's a really great chapter. It's almost, you know, some of it's almost unbelievable. It's like he's written science fiction or something.
No, I mean, sometimes I came across these things and thought, am I reading this right?
With these really Byzantine plots of recruiting gay people, you know, just for their networks, and then also attacking them for the,
and so exactly, that's what I was sort of trying to get at, is that there are all these sources for why this animus exists, and that if we just lump it all together under homophobia, that obscures that fact, and it also obscures the fact that I think this animus can serve political and social purposes, right? That, as you say, it psychologizes it, it makes it an individual thing, and it's
So, yeah, and animus a little bit. So you have a whole long list of like all the different forms that anti-gay animus can take, and how, you know, it shifts, and it shifts decade by decade, and when it focuses on like, you know, seducing young men in one instance, right?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
the other, the fear of prostitution.
Right, fear of the fear of conspiracies, you know, fear of blackmail eventually becomes part of it, especially late in the 80s. There's this case of in West Germany, Günther Kiesling, who's the sort of one of the highest ranking German generals. He's the deputy commander of NATO, and he gets fired because he's gay. And this is sort of the sphere of blackmail that is in some ways sort of an import from the US. And again, I think that talking about animus or talking with language that isn't homophobia allows us to see how these things can cross national boundaries, how it's not just all countries or all Western countries have the same homophobia, right? It's very much inflected by.
Yeah, it's like the work on anti-Semitism, which is increasingly showing it's not one thing, right? Anti-Semitism is incredibly flexible and serves so many different kinds of agendas, and now you can talk about anti-gay animus in that
same
way,
way,
that vocabulary. So the other term that you do a lot of work on, you've mentioned it a couple times already, is this term gay liberation. Yeah, so I want to see more about
Right, and so that one I felt more, you know, this is where the title States of Liberation comes from. And sort of as we've been talking about or getting at throughout this conversation, I'm sort of making the argument that there is no one such thing as gay liberation or queer liberation or emancipation or whatever term it is you want to use. I found liberation sort of the most evocative, and so that's the one I use. But this actually, I was presenting early on when I was writing this, a chapter, and someone said, well, what do you mean by gay liberation? And that really just set me on this trajectory thinking, well, I actually don't know what I mean. And I'm not sure
it's good.
Right. And so eventually what I got to was, again, this realization that by the end of the 1980s, both East and West Germany have this change that has happened. I think, you know, I think in a lot of ways for gay men, life was better in the 80s. In a lot of, again, I mean, you know, there's obvious caveats to that, but if you compare the life of the average German gay man in 1989 compared to 1959, I think things had in some, you know, substantive ways improved, but in very different ways, right? That had a lot to do with, as we talked about, both the state form and the economic forms in both countries. And so, you know, it didn't seem to me that I, as a historian, could come in and sort of offer my judgment of which of these is better, or the sort of correct liberation, or the one that's closer to true liberation. And so I sort of got at this notion that, in fact, liberation it's a changing project, and you know, you might have a sort of utopian horizon of liberation that you're sort of aiming towards, but in terms of how it actually manifests in the historical world, it's always going to be different. It's always going to be changing. It's going to be idiosyncratic, and it's not linear.
And you don't need the category gay, right? Sexual dissidence does not always go under those sort of names around the world. But you do an incredibly good job of historicizing the forms of gay liberation, like you do with the anti-gay animus. And I was particularly struck by you were talking about early on in the post-war period, the difference between scientific liberalism as a sort of argument for the very accommodationist, but scientific liberalism arguing for to get rid of paragraph 175 and so forth, alongside the kind of masculinist, mannerbund, you know, men together version of gay liberation. And then later, by the 70s and 80s, the sort of minoritizing project of gay subcultures, These are all massively different ways.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I guess maybe I'll just explain that. So there's sort of one version of liberation or arguing against this sort of prejudice or this animus, which essentially says that criminalizing homosexuality or criminalizing queerness is both against modern science. It contradicts modern science, that these sort of identities are innately born in us, and that, you know, therefore this is something that should be either, you know, just seen as normal or perhaps treated as, you know, with psychotherapy or something. And similarly, that essentially a liberal penal code shouldn't criminalize victimless crimes. And so therefore this criminalization is in fact contradicting both modern science and sort of a liberal jurisprudence. The idea of a Männerbund, or I mean, this is sort of the wackiest one, is this notion that specifically male homosexuality is not a form of effeminacy or a form of weakness or degeneracy, but rather is a heightened form of masculinity. And this is sort of referencing back to like the ancient Greeks and this sort of imagined notion of sort of ancient Greek pedagogy and so forth. And so the people who belong to this sort of secret club are in fact destined to become leaders, to play a leading role in culture and the nation and society. And so therefore, you know, the idea that you would criminalize it is sort of insane, right? These are sort of the best and the brightest of your society, not the dregs.
It's racist, misogynist, anti-Semitic.
Yes. Oh, it's everything. It's this is where you get, you know, gay fascists.
Yeah.
This is. And then you have sort of, you know, what we think of, I think, much more closely is gay liberation or gay activist projects, as you say, minoritizing projects. This notion that queer people belong to a definable social minority, and that social minority has certain political interests that it can act on and should act on. And I think that's very similar to how in much of the Western world it's evolved since, you know, the 70s. And what I found, you know, interesting also is that in East Germany, you have some of that rhetoric, but because it's taking place under, and here it's both, in some ways it's the economic rhetoric, right? The economic rhetoric of solidarity, and that sort of minorities don't really have a place in a socialist society because you're sort of all workers and farmers and you're in it together. And so what they do, and again, it's hard to parse out how much of it is belief and how much of it is sort of, you know, cynical maneuvering, but they talk about it not as we are a minority who deserve rights, but rather we want to become better socialist citizens. We want to have the same opportunities and better integrate into the socialist whole. And so it's a way of adapting in certain ways that notion of a minoritizing identity or activist effort into a sort of more cohesive socialist project.
Thank you.
Yes.
I do have so many more questions, but it's only 10 minutes left. So
Yes.
questions, listeners, anybody have?
It's also.
I was curious to know about West Berlin and the presence of the military, particularly the American military, and the value system from that era being imported over. Did you find anything interesting in that?
So definitely, I found in West Berlin and in West Germany, as you know, as you mentioned, there are American troops stationed in West Germany throughout this period. I did actually go looking for records of US servicemen who had served in West Germany and basically hit various dead ends. I didn't find much. I did find a couple cases in the 50s and 60s of German men who had had sexual relations with American servicemen and wound up in the court system. There was one in particular, a sex worker who, you know, would basically go and hang out near the barracks on the Americans' payday. And he eventually gets beat up by some American soldiers and is unable to press charges because, you know, sort of sovereign immunity. The other big thing is that the East Germans try to make the case that the American military is sort of regularly seducing youth, right? That they're going out and having sex with teenagers, and that this is further evidence of sort of Western decadence.
Did you have a question?
Sure. So I know that Germany still has an economic divide between East and West. And the thesis of Eastern community more I guess, capable of accepting. Is there still a divide?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, I mean, that's a really good question. In terms of there being a divide in terms of acceptance of LGBT people, I'm actually not sure if that has persisted today or if it exists. One interesting sort of confounding fact is that, as you mentioned, economically, East Germany really suffered with reunification, that there was essentially this process of what was known as shock therapy in other Eastern Bloc countries. And huge numbers of people lose their jobs. They essentially don't have the same social safety net that was guaranteed to them by the East German state. And there's a huge amount of resentment because of this. And so there's a wave of violence in the East German states against both non-white people and against queer people. And so sort of taking out this resentment. And so again, it's this confounding factor of it. They were much more progressive in terms of policy, and also the men and women who I interviewed from East Germany talked about the 1980s as a moment that they experienced a greater sort of deal of acceptance socially. It wasn't just policy from on high. And at the same time, this animus comes out or reveals itself in a moment of economic strength.
And it's also hard to tell what it's really aimed at, right?
Right.
I mean, the last time I was in Berlin, which was a long time ago, but there were two gay pride marches, right?
Yes.
Right. So one is the Christopher Day March, and it's a big commercial
It's sort of what we think of as
big corporate sponsorship, big commercial parade, very class marked, right? And then there's another parade that goes into Kreuzberg.
Kreuzberg, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and it's Turkish people and working class people and trans people who didn't feel at that time so welcome at the main march. And the demands are for anti-corporate globalization. It's like the demands are these sort of large economic demands and not invoking identity in the same way, invoking solidarity over identity. And it's also a massive march.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah,
it's
it is.
huge, it's huge.
Yeah.
So then there are two of them that are happening. And that feels like that maybe is a little bit East Germany, West Germany, but not entirely. It's also Turkish and
I think it's layered.
and yeah.
Yeah.
But so the animus could sometimes be at gay people as a kind of scapegoating thing, but it could also be a kind of class rage at a certain way, a certain kind of gains that's being drawn.
I think it's class related. I also think it's in the same way that Putin, for instance, has tried to make homosexuality and queerness sort of markers of being Western.
Yeah.
I think it's quite possible that you have the same thing, that these were seen all of a sudden as markers of Westernness, and it was a convenient outlet for resentment against the West German government for what it was doing to East Germany.
I wonder if you found anything about differences in response to the AIDS pandemic,
Oh,
Yeah,
yes.
he's got
East
all of
and
that.
West.
Yeah.
Yes. So the biggest difference is I think, again, for us as Americans with the US response, right? We are familiar with Reagan's just absolute willful neglect and the incredibly devastating consequences of that in our country. And in West Germany, you have a conservative government, a Christian democratic government that's in charge, and you do have some of the same like animus and fear mongering, especially in the very conservative state of Bavaria. There's talk of quarantining people with AIDS, of making them register. They have a mandatory testing requirement for certain employees and people who are migrants, and they test people who are minors as well as people as old as 80 forcibly. So you do have that, but at the federal level, this minister for health named Rita Süssmuth belongs to the moderate wing, and she works with the gay men and lesbians who have founded sort of it's called AIDS self-help organizations. She works with them. She gives them immense amounts of funding to spread information about safer sex, about how the disease spreads. Her ministry sends a pamphlet to every single West German home explaining what the disease is and how it spreads. And it's successful. I mean, and I actually have in the book, I love showing this off because I feel like this shouldn't exist. But there are these incredibly racy posters that the federal government funds. I mean, they're completely pornographic posters. They're fabulous. And and again, you just can't imagine an American government funding something like this, let alone a conservative government. And it works, which I think is a really important point, that it brings down the infection rate dramatically. So you still have a huge amount of death and suffering, but it is not at all. It's not the same scale. The saunas never closed, the bathhouses never closed in West Germany. East Germany was actually protected by the lack of a sort of commercial subculture, by the lack of bathhouses and so forth, as well as the wall, as well as the Iron Curtain, that there wasn't as much migration. And so you have just a fraction of the numbers of cases in East Germany that you do in the West. And the government there also tries to work with these new activist groups to spread information. There you have sort of funny, or I don't know if funny is the right word, but ironic sort of instances where, for instance, the government will be spreading information about, okay, you need to use condoms to have safer sex. And the gay men will say, okay, well, great, but there's a rubber shortage and there are no condoms. Because again, this is also in the midst that, you know, the East German sort of debt is spiraling out of control, and you have shortages of various imported goods. And so anyway, both very different, but also both much better situations. And as a result, I found AIDS simply was not as present of a memory for the people I interviewed as it would be for people the same age in the US.
Well, I want you to use your last few minutes to tell everyone about at least one, you have two new projects. The one I want you to talk about is lesbian Nazis. And then the other one is that's not an easy project. And the next one, the other one is occupied forces in Germany. The lesbians project, it's sort of a project I've been pursuing in conjunction with this. When I first went to start researching this, I found a couple cases of lesbian women who had been denounced to the Nazi police in the 1930s, 1940s. And I thought, that's weird. I have not read a lot about lesbians in Nazi Germany. I wonder what's going on here. So I got them printed off and took them home with me, and I sort of read them carefully. I started reading around in the literature that exists. There's not a lot of literature on this. And it just sort of grabbed me as a topic because as we sort of talked about how lesbian women experience persecution, animus, and how they engage with the state and society is very different than how they do so in this era. And so I've now published a couple articles based on these various files, and I keep sort of finding more and more. And I sort of have enough of a corpus now that I feel like I can write a book about it. And it basically, the upshot is I think lesbian women were persecuted, even though But some of them were Nazis as well. And
then, yes, some of them were also Nazis. You do have, for instance, there are cases that other scholars have written about of lesbian concentration camp guards, for instance. And so and I've written about a case of a woman who was a hospital director, was a member of the party, and then it comes out that she's a lesbian, and she's stripped of her party membership. She's stripped of her right to run a hospital. So it's a complicated history that just really, it's not a simple history to tell. Anyway, has grabbed me.
Interesting.
Yes.
Okay. So I think we've
reached the time limit. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
We have Samuel's book as well as Lisa's book on Ayn Rand, if you haven't had enough about greedy fascists. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. It was fun.